something that sticks in my mind. I don't know why, but you can put into a Chevy 2500 full-size pickup truck with stake beds with the side on the top. You can stack 28 bodies. I shouldn't know that, but that's one day, 28 bodies stacked in the back of that, pulled them off, you know, and had to categorize, take pictures of all the injuries, how they were executed to send up for intel, So, and in a mass casualty, it's, yeah, I've been in them before, but when you're the only medic and, a car bomb goes off in an area, in a little market area, all that confusion, there's still, secondaries to worry about, you may be, still getting shot at.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today's guest is Colby. Colby is a full-time real estate investor and co-founder of Sentinel Equity Group. He's been investing in real estate since 2001 and has managed numerous fix and flips, a portfolio of single-family rentals, as well as been a private note lender. Colby then realized that for scalability and long-term wealth, that multifamily real estate and acquisitions are where he needed to be. He acquired over 600 rental units and expanded his company into 3 markets. Colby has a passion for helping people to safely invest in real estate. He loves real estate because of the controllability of your inputs and outputs, risk aversion, and tax incentives. He also served 23 years of distinguished military service as a senior executive managing facilities and projects in multiple states, multi-million-dollar budgets, and hundreds of enlisted Air Force members. As a wounded warrior, he has a passion for giving back to his community by helping homeless and struggling veterans and supporting first responders. He now donates 20% of his profits to veteran and first responder charities. Colby, I appreciate you so much for being on the show today.
Rochelle, it's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me on. Listening to the bio is kind of like going back and reading performance reports of being in the military.
I know it's always weird when you tell someone, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself or talk about yourself. And I always struggled with that aspect in the military too. So, but that being said, I would love to just hear a little bit more about your story and just dive a little bit deeper into you.
Yeah, sure. My pleasure. Glad for the opportunity to speak with your listeners and stuff today. It's everyone has a unique story. And like you mentioned, I love helping out my brothers and sisters, whether it's selective duty, guard, reserve, retired. There's a lot to after the military. There is another life and stuff. And, we all have our different paths. And, you did mention, yes, I was part of the Air Force Wounded Warrior. And how that became about is I had a very unique, as my wife says, I did the Air Force wrong. I actually spent more time deployed probably with the Army and the Marines than actually with Air Force units. So I was a medic, jumped out of airplanes, had some cool stuff, got some advanced training. So basically I was doing a lot of outside the wire missions. And so ended up doing about 8 deployments between, the end of 2001, right after September 11th, all the way up through December of 2007. So, deployed a little over 1,000 days. As a medic, I was in 7 mass casualty. I did 4 of those in one deployment by myself on the streets of Baghdad. Lost some friends, been in multiple firefights, took an IED to the face, a couple different blast injuries, and jumping out of airplanes is really cool when you're 25, but it really wasn't worth the extra $125 a month for the amount of concussions and hard landings that I ended up with after being on 5 years of jump status. And but I really love my job. I loved being a medic. I love being with the troops. I love, having that sense of purpose and that camaraderie. And, I thrived. But, all those exposures and whether it's, blast injuries, not only that, I just on the one deployment in 2006, we were, the surge in Iraq. We were in downtown Baghdad. I think on that deployment alone, I probably picked up, and identified or cataloged like 600 different bodies, from due to the sectarian violence. So that can kind of just wears on you after a while. And one of the things, it's nothing was a you're going to be changed, but you don't realize that you've changed because it's kind of a slow progression. None of my injuries, I did have some issues right away that were noticeable. The IED, I don't remember much of the rest of that day. I had conversations I have no recollection of, but apparently I still performed my duties. I just don't remember it. But it wasn't until probably a year or two later, after my deployments and stuff, that I really started noticing some issues. I ended up noticing that I was falling up and down stairs quite a bit, and mainly upstairs. And just chalked it up as I'm getting clumsy. I need to slow down. I would forget things. I remember one morning I forgot my PT shoes and couldn't find them. Found them 3 days later. Had no idea how they got to where they got. And I live by myself, so it's not like I had a roommate or anybody that was messing with me. So a lot of instances like that just started to creep up and become noticeable. And you know, being a medic, it's like you kind of self identify a little bit. You self treat, just like anything else. You don't want to go in and I don't have it that bad, and this is nothing they can do for me. But I will say is I finally did go in, and nobody could find anything. They're just like, oh yeah, I went and got brain scans, and they're just like, oh yeah, you are being clumsy. Hey, maybe go over to mental health and stuff. And I would go, and then they would just, I would get some treatment, and I didn't feel it was very, very effective. And I went through 5 primary care providers in a 5-year span. And so from 2000 into 2007 to 2012. So in that 5 years, I actually had PCS from the unit I was operating and deploying a lot with, and went to a training command. And I will say is that transition was when I really started noticing the difficulties and stuff that I was having at adapting. While I was with my old unit, I had a support network. I had, buddies that I could go out and go drinking with and talking to. We had the same shared experiences, and it was good. You didn't feel embarrassed. It's, you could talk about different things. Go to my new unit, and nobody had deployed, or they had, but they had been, FOBITs, right? Or, they stayed in, never did outside the wire missions. And so it was really hard to connect or relate with anybody. And that's when I really, started noticing that, hey, I was isolating myself, really hiding a lot of my issues. But then, they became more apparent, the falls. I would actually have conversations. I was an NCOIC of the medical section, and I would literally walk out of my office into the little bay that had all the other medics, and we would have a conversation. I'd walk back into my office and have no recollection of what we just talked about. And there's many times I'd go back and be like, what did we just cover? And it got to the point where my troops started to notice, they're like, are you all right? This isn't this isn't, normal and stuff. And so I at least had that. I'm like, all right, if my troops are noticing this, I need to do what's right, not just for me, but for them, set the good example. And that's when I did start going and trying to seek help. And, back in 2007 and 2008, a lot of folks probably on here don't remember. If you were in prior to that, you may remember that's 2008 is when they started doing the TBI, traumatic brain injury questionnaires, pre and post deployment. So prior to that, I did all my deployments and stuff all prior to that. And so it didn't have a baseline or anything to go off of. So when I was going into the docs and stuff and talking, I don't think I was really taken serious. So again, went through 5 different providers. They were PCSing, moving duty stations each year. That didn't help. Was really struggling by the end of that 5th year, and went in one day and I had a brand new, my new PCN, new primary care manager, and a young captain. She just came into the Air Force, finished medical school, her first duty assignment. I think she'd only been a month on station. And of course, I come in, trusty, disgruntled E7 at the time, and just literally went off. This is crap. I know there's something wrong with me. Nobody's helping. Is this physiological or psychological? Somebody tell me so I can go and attack this. If it's, do I need to go to mental health? I'll go to mental health. Do I need to, go to physical therapy or whatever? I'll go. Tell me. I just couldn't get any answers. And she gave me the only, I remember this distinctly because I didn't hold back and I didn't care. I was perfect. I didn't cuss or anything. I wasn't like, attacking her. I was just vented my frustrations. And, she had this big saucer plate eyes because I don't think she's ever had a patient really do that before. And she gave me the first honest answer out of any provider. She's like, Sergeant Bowers, she goes, I'll be honest with you. I have no idea. But I do promise you that I will figure this out and we'll get you to the help you need. And I just looked at her and I said, ma'am, I said, thank you. That is the first honest answer that anyone has given me in 5 years. I said, now, everyone else has said the same thing about helping me. I'm not going to hold my breath on that, but at least thank you for being honest and talk to you later. Left. Nothing ever happened. I just went, you know what? I'm just going to go on my day. It was about a week later, I actually had a nurse contact, said, hey, your doc called me. I just got back. I'm one of the case managers. She told me about your history. And she's like, what's interesting? I just literally got back last week from a TBI where we went and were being basically trained and told about all these different DOD level opportunities, healthcare opportunities for our active duty service members. And she's like, I think you might be a candidate. And so anyway, the next week I went into her office, spent 3 hours. I went through my whole list of here's when when I know I got my first concussion, here's my first blast injury, here's my hard fall. Because I got knocked out on a convoy. We were doing convoy operations and we destroyed 2 vehicles. I got knocked out for like 30 seconds and just did my whole thing. And she's just like, wow. And literally within a month, I was at Bethesda in Maryland and went down there to big guns called NICO, National Interpretive Center of Excellence. And what was so cool about that is I got my first answers. I sat into a room with literally 12 different nurses, doctors, physical therapists, neurologists, surgeons, mental health, you name it. They were there, pharmacists. Because by this time I was on like 5 or 6 different medications because I couldn't sleep. I was having nightmares. Then I was too drowsy, and so I was on uppers, I was on downers, I was on a host of different things because everyone just started giving me stuff. And I got my first diagnosis of, hey, guess what, Sergeant Bowers, you have a traumatic brain. We can see it. The testing proves it. And oh, guess what? The military screwed up and they let you down because they never officially diagnosed you with PTSD. You have chronic PTSD and, sorry, but, the damage is done. But you know what? We think we can get a plan to get you a little bit, get you better and get you functional. And I'll tell you what is that right there, that conversation in that 30 seconds, this huge weight came off my shoulders because I'm like, is this all in my head? Am I making this up? Am I that weak? Is there anything wrong with me? I'm like, am I going crazy? And literally, yes, I was, but it was, but officially, yes, I was had PTSD. I had physical issues, but it was a huge relief. And, I'd like to say at that point is the miracle, all the stars aligned and, and I was able to get better, but no, that was just the start. I was still in denial. I was still active duty. I still didn't want to share the stigma. I was still going to mental health. One of the first things I realized going to mental health, whether it's active duty, civilian, what have you, they are not all created equal. I literally, and from 2012, when I finally made it to Bethesda, to 2017, and 2017, and that'll be important here in a minute. I literally went through 9 different mental health providers. I had one where I walked in, it was a civilian. They sent me off base because none of the active duty providers had any experience with combat related issues. And this is the Air Force. So, we're, the chair force, not used to this. And against, there's no Army. There was nothing around close by that I could go and dive into. So they sent me off base. I had a civilian provider. She came in. She's like, "Oh, sir, you know, Colby, I know exactly what you're going through. I have PTSD myself. You know, I was raped." And I was just like, "This makes no sense." I'm like, "How can you?" I'm like, "I wasn't raped. I have no idea what you went through." And I know that was traumatic, but I'm like, that was my last time. I never even went back. I'm just like, this is BS. Literally walked out, never went back. And because I was still in denial, I was still trying to be active. Ended up receiving a couple of more concussions. I had fallen, hit my head, doing stupid stuff because my balance, you know, physical therapy was a joke. And I was just, again, in that little piece of denial. And so I actually got worse. And so I retired in 2016 and the reason because I had injured myself again. I ended up retiring instead of going through the med board. And I had a cane. I was walking with a cane. My son was 2 years old at that time. Sorry, no. He was a year. He was born in 2015. I retired at the end of 2016. And I didn't have a relationship with my son. I couldn't hold him for long periods of time for risk of falling. My wife would not let me, especially at night, because if I couldn't see and I didn't have a visual awareness, you know, to try to go in and comfort him, I was falling. I was falling up and down stairs still. Like my wife wouldn't even let me carry him up or down stairs. And so it's just because of that, I didn't bond with him. And so it was all these struggles. And so I had it in my head that, you know, okay, now I have a newborn. He's a little over one. He's not even 2 years old yet. And you know, I'm retired, and you know what, I had a cane. I was a fall risk. Like the doctors were like, I was on my way, I was on the program, and I was slated to get me a service dog for my falls, not a comfort dog, but an actual service, because I was falling. You know, some of them would go get me help if I fell. And so, yeah, you know, it was a spiral down. And my thought was, is like, you know what? I'm going to go to my son's high school graduation in a wheelchair if I even live that long at all, which I really highly doubted I was even going to make it that long. Because I knew it's just, I was like, I couldn't live like this, and I was going to be better off dead than with my family. So, you know, my wife is very, very strong. We're still married, knock on wood, fortunately, you know, but she has a big shoe and she had no problems putting it right square in my ass. I'm sure she should have left me and I wouldn't have blamed her multiple times, but she never gave up. And that was the critical link to me finally getting better. So much so because I had given up at that point. I was drinking heavily. I was literally an alcoholic. It's still traumatizing my sleep. I woke up and I've hit her. I was asleep, not even remember it the next morning, not from being drunk, just startled in sleep. You name it, and I was angry outbursts. Everything that anyone ever struggles with, or you hear about. I was there. But what did I do about it? Well, I isolated even more, and I did the opposite of what they tell you. And I knew better, and I should have known better, but you can't help it. So that's one thing I tell to any veteran I talk to now that's struggling is, it's all right. It's all right to isolate. It's all right to feel sorry for yourself. It's all right to drink, right? To an extent, but what's not all right is to use that as your crutch. We all have good days and bad days. You know what? Yes, feel sorry for yourself. But what are you going to do the next day? And that's the struggle. Fast forward, finally 2017. In 2017, I ended up getting accepted into and going to the Marcus Institute of Brain Health. It's a big nonprofit. Bernie Marcus, the co-founder of Home Depot, donated $36 million to start this nonprofit in this brain institute. The director, interesting story, like kind of how small this world is here, is the director of the Marcus Institute was also handpicked by DOD and was the director and started up the National Interpretive Center of Excellence out of Bethesda. When his contract was up, he enjoyed it and saw the need so much, he actually approached Bernie Marcus, and that's how he started this. I was one of the first patients to go through NICA. I think I was the second Air Force person ever to go through it. And I was the third cohort to actually go through the Marcus Institute. Again, it was set up the exact same, went in, told my story, hey, got more injuries. The difference in this time was, though, is I was absolutely ready to get off my ass and do something. And the other critical piece that NICO hadn't figured out yet six, back in 2012, it was 6 years prior, again, because this is all new science, was the physical therapy piece of it. And I went in there with a cane, a fall risk, like again, like I was like a couple weeks out to of getting my dog. I was on the list. I was just waiting for my dog. Went to this 3 week program, and the last week I walked out without my cane. I was able to walk for the first time with my head up because the testing they did, they realized that my auditory processing due to blast injuries and from my concussions had disrupted my internal balance, and with my ears. And then at the time, I couldn't feel my feet. So my what they call proprioception wasn't, the signals weren't getting to my brain. And so really all I was relying on was eyesight. So if I closed my eyes, was in a dark environment, that's when I was always falling. And so through physical therapy, and it was horrible. It was the worst experience. I thought I was going to throw up each day. And we're doing this like every day to every other day in physical therapy with lights and all this stuff to where it's like you want to cry. The first week was the worst. The second week, you start seeing improvements. The third week, it's like, oh my God, it's like, dude, it's like you're a miracle worker. It was a huge paradigm shift. And I had been walking and dealing with the cane and my dealing with the visual so much that I didn't realize it, but I was staring at the ground and been doing it for so many years that the natural curvature in my neck had gone away, which was causing neck problems, which was leading to migraines. And you kind of see how everything exacerbates here. To when I left out of there, literally one day on the third week, I part of my thing. He's like, "Go for a walk around the camp." I just remember going, "Wow, the leaves on here, these are green." It's like first time I'd seen the leaves, and recognized leaves and the colors of trees because I was always staring at the sidewalks. So, leaving out was a huge new leash on life. I actually got into and found a physical therapist, and she was my 10th or 11th one at this time, who had experience working with veterans, had all, I mean, just it was a perfect fit. And so long story short is going through. So between 2018 and now fast forward to 2021, I don't drink anymore. I'm still walking without my cane. Now I still have balance issues. I'm never going to be 100%, but I can go hiking. I can go do a lot of the stuff that I couldn't do before. I'm outside playing with my son, building that relationship. And now it's not like I went from, like I said, not thinking I was going to live to be at my son's high school graduation to, now I'm running a successful, real estate investment company. We got $64 million in assets under management as of last month. And, last year I summited Mount Kilimanjaro through a nonprofit my wife and I started. And, and that's why I give back to veterans. I love talking to veterans, especially wounded warriors, TBI, PTSD, because I know the struggles. I was there. I spent a week inpatient because I was starting to shoot myself one time. I'm hoping I want to be out there to be that, hopefully that beacon of hope and to show folks that listen, man, maybe I'm not as bad as Colby was, but I can't, I'm self-isolated. I'm on this couch. Holy shit, this guy had it worse than me. And I know I had to have it way better than others. But if I can inspire somebody to go, wow, if this guy can get off his ass and go from walking with a cane to summiting Mount Kilimanjaro, not by myself. I did it with 3 other wounded warriors, 2 Army guys in the Navy, and had a Marine who was tri-service. It was awesome. And we, had that success. And we all had TBIs, we all had PTSD, we all had the same issues. 3 of us actually patients together at the Marcus Institute, and we overcame it. So that's where I'm at, today, and why I love having this opportunity to come tell my story, because I wish my leadership, I wish my peers, even junior folks, would have talked about the struggles and stuff, you know, years ago, and I probably could have had a much more productive life and would not have missed out on first part of my son's life.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your story, Colby. Wow, how incredible everything that you've been through, everything you've overcome, and to be here today to continue to inspire others. It's truly amazing. So, I know when we hear these short spurts of someone's story, it's hard for us, I say us as in, like someone like me who hasn't gone through the physical trauma of combat injuries, the TBI, the things that you've gone through. Sometimes it's hard for us to really imagine just how long of a journey it is when you're going through it yourself, especially when we hear this like 20-minute synopsis of it. So, obviously that was a lot for you to go through and overcome. And so, amazing that you're here, standing here today and telling us a story and giving back to others. What really, really stood out to me in the beginning of your story is I believe you mentioned that they did a brain scan. What was missed on that initial brain scan where they didn't see a traumatic brain injury? Is there something specific that needs to be looked for?
Yeah, so they're looking for like little micro brain bleeds and stuff. But what they're realizing, and here's the other thing: in 2012, there's only two MRIs in the nation, one at the Bethesda, and then one out at somewhere out in California. I think at a civilian, were the two strongest MRI machines in the nation. And even then, they knew that they were limited. So when I went through and had my scans, nothing stood out. But what was interesting and what was really cool about it is they didn't just stop at that. Now, prior to going to Bethesda, I had CT scans, MRIs, because obviously if you're having balance issues, you're having short-term memory issues, confusion of speech and things like that. They're like they won't look at the brain and see what's going on, what's potentially wrong with it. And so they were coming up as negative. Oh, you're normal. And when I went through NICO, they understood because they do, everybody that comes through there as a patient gets a brain scan. Whether they think they need it or not, everyone gets it. Everyone gets a sleep study. Everyone, there's a certain amount of testing you get the first 3 days. Everybody gets it across the line. And then there's further follow-up testing that goes on is more of like gait testing, walking, different things to really test like fine motor skills and balance. And what they were telling us is two things that they had recognized. One is even their MRI scan was not showing abnormalities in the brain, but yet when they would do the fine-tuned testing through physical therapy and different things that they could do, they were still identifying brain injury. So that's a big part of it is, when you go through, if you don't go to a big organization like that and they send you out to go get testing, it may not show up. And what they're realizing is a lot of veterans, like myself, has multiple concussions. So, and it gets exacerbated over time. So it compounds. It's not necessarily means you're going to get a brain, like that's the easy one. That's when you get in a car wreck or you're staying on a bomb and you get blown 30 feet and knocked unconscious. There's going to be some indications of issues a lot of times. But if you're just you're taking that concussive blast, where it knocks the wind out of you or knocks you silly, but yet you're still able to function, you may not do those, it may not cause those big injuries that they're seeing and what they expect to see, but they're going to accumulate over time. And that's what I was finding out is after my last concussion, I actually fell. I was on this kind of a side of a hill and had a rucksack on. I was hunting with my brother and I got dizzy. I sat down, external structure of the rucksack hit me in the back of the head. And I was loopy for 3 days and it didn't hit me that hard. So it just, I could really started to see it going, okay, my symptoms are getting worse each and every time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder how many active duty, how many vets are walking around with TBIs and aren't aware because the technology just doesn't really exist. Because I was always under the understanding that that's something that a regular MRI would be able to show you. So from what you're saying, there are specific, very specific targeted tests, and there are very specific targeted MRIs, but then also sounds like very particular specialists that deal with these things that know exactly what to look for. Otherwise, it's just brushed off as, oh, it's probably just something mental or maybe just clumsiness. So that's really interesting. I want to go back to the beginning of your service for a little bit because I know you talked about when you had deployed, there were all these things that you did, that for a lot of people are considered extremely traumatic and I'm sure in some ways did contribute to your PTSD, but you talked about the numbers of bodies that you've dealt with, the physical traumas that you've been through with IEDs and the things you've seen, out in the field. When you first joined the military, did you have an idea of what you're getting into? Is the first question. And then the second question, and I can repeat this later if we get too much in conversation and forget. But the second question is, how did you cope with that stuff prior to your PTSD diagnosis? Did you just brush it off like I know a lot of people do, or did you cope in other ways?
Yeah, no, good questions. So no, I joined during peacetime. I joined in the early '90s, so it was post Gulf War One. Missed out on. I was in high school, and you know, so I didn't join because of there was something going on, or any preconceived notions that I was going to be doing what I was doing. And even when I joined Air Force, nobody would have even thought that as a med tech or medic in the Air Force that I'd have been doing, even in the career field. It never really happened unless you were, special operations, pararescue, things of that nature. It was like I think less than 3% of the Air Force back when I came in, ever did like combat related stuff. And I think even during the height of OEF and OIF, I think that was only like 5 or 7%. So still a very small amount. And I was just happened to be at the right place at the right time with these opportunities. And so, yeah, so that's how I got into it. But I loved it. I always, even though I joined the Air Force, I always had that sense of adventure, always wanted to kind of deploy, and as being a medic, I worked in emergency rooms and acute care clinics, and I always like to, can I handle this? How do I do under pressure? So I really looked for and sought out those types of situations. But no matter, I worked ER, I did a year in Korea, and I think we had 5 deaths, 5 or 6 deaths on base, so I was like, had done CPR, and like that was the most amount of death I'd seen in a short amount of time, and adapted well for it. That was the late '90s, but none of that prepared me for what I was going to see or do down the road. I will say is looking back on it, my deployments were very unique because I never went to the same place twice, which is unheard of for the Air Force. So we're used to doing what they call steady state rotations. So, but the unit I was with was very unique, and we were considered like the 911 of the Air Force for conventional side. So we would go in to where new bases and where things, hey, Army needs help or Marines need help. And that goes back to is why I was always assigned with them. We were groups of Air Force assigned to the Army. I got my combat patch for the 82nd and 4th ID. That's how embedded we were, with our sister organizations. When it first started out, it's like, we were on base, doing base defense. I did some convoys, like on my next deployment. Looking back, it helped me prepare because my last deployment was the one where it was the full on, like we were, outside the wire every day, doing patrols, mounted, dismounted patrols with, we were training Iraqi police. And up to that, I probably had, a couple hundred dead bodies, if you will, between coalition and civilians. But they were still in controlled setting. And, it was still chaotic. I did 2 mass casualties, did one in '03 where the bombing of Al Nazariya in southern Iraq. I was there, manning a casualty collection point on base. And, my next one I did a couple years later in Iraq. I think Camp Sather had some mortars came in on Army post, went over and picked up a bunch of patients and came back and were treating them and stuff. And we were doing off-base patrolling, but we would get shot at. We found some IEDs, but it wasn't like overly chaotic, if that makes sense. It was stressful. Don't get me wrong, because it's high ops tempo, but the one in '06 when the surge and we got fully put up, and what was great is the team I was with and the troops, we had been working together for the past 5 years. So we had trained together, we deployed together, we knew each other, and we had a history. So that was huge. So we had great unit cohesion. And that's what allowed us to be successful because literally from day one, I mean, the sectarian violence. I stopped counting at 200 after a month and a half of, between kids, women, old people, civilians that were all, tortured and executed. You name it, ice picks, screwdrivers, drills. Pick a horror movie. That's what we were seeing on a daily basis. That amount and volume is really hard to prepare for. Something that sticks in my mind, I don't know why, but you can put into a Chevy 2500 full size pickup truck with stake beds with a side on the top. You can stack 28 bodies in. I shouldn't know that, but that's one day 28 bodies stacked in the back of that. Pulled them off, you know, and had to categorize, take pictures of all the injuries, how they were executed, to send up for intel. So and in a mass casualty, it's, yeah, I've been in them before, but when you're the only medic and a car bomb goes off in an area, in a little market area, all that confusion, there's still secondaries to worry about. You may be still getting shot at, but yet you're still you're setting up your security perimeter. I'm the only medic, and so I was going into those hot zones, but I had a security element. I had my NCO, or one of the NCOs, non-medic, that his whole job was to protect me. And if I knew if he grabbed me, my job was just to stop whatever I'm doing, because you get tunnel vision. I'm focusing on patients, and his was to maintain situational awareness. And there's multiple times where he'd had to grab me, and I'd have to stop whatever I was doing because we were sniper fire, or whatever the case may be. So it's surreal, and then you don't have time to decompress, and then you're in that day in and day out, like literally every single day. It's challenging. Then you come back stateside, and you stop 3 days in Qatar to decompress. Well, that's not enough time. 72 hours from your last engagement, firefight, to you're at the bar back at home station, drinking with a bunch of civilians. Uh, that's usually not a great combination. So
Yeah, I hear from a lot of combat veterans really, really similar stories, um, similar to yours. And it seems like the military hasn't really figured out an efficient way to transition people back from combat back to quote unquote normal life back stateside. And I've never been in a combat environment, so I don't really think I'm in the position to say what would be the best way to transition people back. It's such a unique thing, right? I mean, how do you really adequately give someone the tools? I don't know. And I'm sure there's ways to do it. You might have more insight on that than I do, but it seems like just throwing people back, giving them a few days and saying, all right, go back to your normal job just isn't enough. And we're not in the same environment now, obviously, that we were in the early 2000s when it comes to combat. A lot of these stories I hear from these combat vets, individuals like you who were there in the heat of it right after 9/11. Things were different. Obviously, still operations always going on around the world, always people being affected, but I don't know if the military has effectively figured out how to take care of the combat, active duty, and combat vets. So, what do you think would have been more helpful for you at that time?
you know yeah, obviously retrospect, and a lot of time to think on this. And and I've done a little bit of studying and stuff too. Is there's a lot less, um, from what I see, is the World War II troops that were coming back, especially from the European campaign. They didn't fly them home. They put them on ships, and so they had basically and it took 2 weeks. So there's a lot. There is some evidence to show that having that a 2 week downtime where you still have your support, you're with your buddies, right, quote unquote. Um, there's some benefit to that, to allow you to decompress, rehash stories and stuff. To basically where you desensitize yourself and you can kind of open up and deal with it. Money was no object. What would be cool, I say cool, but also I think beneficial, is if we could have had something similar to that post deployment. Maybe they fly us into, Qatar, or some jump off point, And I know this is, more fantasy than actuality, but and if they could have had like cruise liners and you put the troops on there, but not just that, is you have mental health and medical and stuff, and you have it as a rigid thing. It's, and come back, there's still a pool, you can still ice cream, you can still, have all the cool stuff that you can't get when you're in country, but yet you still have some of that support, doing group discussions and stuff. I think would have had a impact. I really looking back, I think it would have definitely benefited myself and a lot of my other, uh, veteran friends that were with me at that time. I still keep in contact with. We're all struggling at one point, to different levels. Um, but that's just, one thing that always keeps coming back to me. If we could have done something a little bit more structured and protracted, I think we would have less chronic PTSD. We're always going to have, your acute PTSD, but I think hitting that up front would have given a lot more coping mechanisms, positive coping mechanisms, because alcohol and, going, 150 on a motorcycle or those different crazy things are not positive coping mechanisms. Um, I think we have seen a lot better outcome, and I think we would have set up our veterans, a lot better for the return home.
No, I agree. And I don't think that it's out of the question to have something better like that. I mean, maybe not fully to the extent that you described, just knowing what the government structure is in the US, but doing something better for active duty when they come back. I mean, I don't think that that's completely out of the question to ask for, especially when we're asking the combat vets to give up so much to defend the country. So, um, phenomenal suggestion, and I hope that we see more things come to light for even the veterans that served, back in the day and are still dealing with PTSD. And especially when we talk about the TBIs, PTSD, all these things that I think are now starting to come more to light as we have these conversations in society about mental health, how that's affecting different populations, especially our military, and understanding that there's maybe a connection between certain activities people are doing and ways that people are acting, such as excessive drinking, such as you mentioned, speeding excessively on the interstate, these things that maybe aren't necessarily people trying to be belligerent, but maybe associated with something deeper and someone that wasn't taken care of. And so I know this is a great segue into what you're doing with your nonprofit. And so I know that you have such a big heart in giving back and helping other people. And you have this nonprofit. And I'd love if you just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so my wife and I started a nonprofit called the Paper Crane Foundation, and we use that through that nonprofit is we took six veterans, and that's when we did the summoning to Mount Kilimanjaro last year. But the reason we started this is we didn't want to be one of those, red carpet, event style nonprofits. I think there's something like 40,000 veteran related nonprofits nationwide. They're good. I've been to those events. I've been skiing. I've done, these couple retreats and stuff like that, and they all have their pros and cons. But they're just small. You go for a week. You're there with other veterans, and it's really great. You can have these discussions. Then you leave and you go home. But what not a lot of nonprofits are out there doing is, how can we get earlier detection? One of the things my wife she's like the self-made expert on TBI and PTSD, because a lot of folks with almost, I think she has the statistics, but it's over 90% of people that suffer from the TBI end up developing PTSD because of the physical and issues and stuff with it transfer over and it manifests as PTSD. So I want to say one of the last studies, something like the average veteran is it's taking 6 years to be properly identified and diagnosed with the TBI. So that's 6 years that they're going without proper treatment. Because if you can catch it in enough time, you can heal the brain. But if 6 years, your brain's already healed as best as it's going to, yes, you can do some more relearning. There's a lot of things that you can do to make that veteran or that patient better. But man, imagine if you would have caught it within 6 months of their injury, how much better that they would have their outcome would have been. So that's the premise of our nonprofit is we want to focus on research and earlier detection. So we're trying to build some partnerships up. There are a few other or not nonprofits, a few other companies that are developing more of an objective way to get earlier testing for traumatic brain injury. So we're trying to work with them to get this technology fielded closer to the injury. Because right now, if you go to the emergency room and you smack your head, yes, they may go and get you an MRI, right? But we already talked about that. It's not necessarily going to show anything. And the other thing is going to do follow my finger. And that's very subjective, right? Because what's the lighting in the room? How tired is that clinician that's giving that test? Because they're looking for eye movements, and there's a lot of micro eye movements that even if you're on your A game as a doctor, you're going to miss. So that's where there's a lot of that subjectivity. So there's new technology and stuff out there that we want to see put out that's more objective. It's actually little devices you put on the patient, and it does some basically follow my finger, but it follows the dot. And because there's all the cameras, it can actually pick up all those micro movements that would typically be missed and allow for potentially an earlier diagnosis. And then the phase two of it we're working on is the earlier treatment, because it goes back to physical therapy is, not all physical therapists are basically generalists, right? So you go in and, they're going to treat your ankle, they're going to treat your balance, they're going to, they treat, they're jack of all trades, which is great. But if you go in there with balance issues and a TBI, they may not have all the tools necessary to get you to where you need to. And so that's the other thing is coming up with the right protocols and stuff. And we're working with like the Marcus Institute and some other nonprofits to help develop those and get those pushed out as well. To not just, and this is a benefit not just for veterans, but this has an impact, worldwide if you think about it. So one last statistic, and I'll shut up. But there's 8 million concussions in the U.S. alone each year.
Yeah,
You know,
it's interesting. When I first talked to you, I put out on my social media information about, I talked to you. You have a nonprofit that helps people with TBIs, and I had a number of friends that reached out to me that I had no idea had suffered a TBI, and they told me, "Hey, I suffered a TBI. I'm really, really excited to learn more." And so there are people out there, and it's not even all of them were veterans or associated with the military. So I know that what you do is absolutely needed. I appreciate that you are doing what you do, because there is so many people out there that I believe are silently suffering and maybe don't even realize that they're suffering. So from a patient advocacy standpoint, because obviously, even if the technology exists, not every single emergency room in the country, not every single person's going to be trained on this stuff. So at some point, us as people need to learn what to look out for, how to advocate for ourselves. What tips do you have for patient advocacy if someone thinks that, hey, I maybe have a TBI? And then are there certain things that you think someone should look out for, or certain events that you would say, hey, go get further testing, push for yourself so that you can get more answers and potentially find out that you have a TBI?
yeah, 100%. I mean, the best patient advocate is you as the patient yourself. You have to be your own advocate. We all have our nightmare VA stories, and I didn't even talk about those. Mine were still on active duty, and being a medic myself, there wasn't a lot of information. And I will say there is a lot more information out there now on traumatic brain injury and then support um, efforts out there, and then how to get help. My wife is actually one of her goals with her nonprofit is to develop a page that is a list of resources. Um, so because there's so many out there. Where do you start? And then how do you break that conversation when you go in and you talk to your doctor? Look at Dr. Google. If you know you've had a TBI, that's great, but still go and educate yourself on what a traumatic brain injury is and all the different signs and symptoms. What amazed me, right, is, you hear a lot of veterans that are like, oh, they don't like loud spaces, right? They're very uncomfortable. They're on guard. They can't handle it. Creates anxiety. I was the same way, but I have an auditory processing disorder. And so when I'm in loud environments, basically my brain can't differentiate between different sound levels. So, which added to my anxiety. So like you and I could be having a perfect conversation. You're in a bar, and all I would hear is wah 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 wah. That right there, everyone think, oh, that's PTSD because you can't be around crowds because X, Y, and Z. Maybe not. You might be, so there's a lot of folks that have a traumatic brain injury potentially have that as well. There's going to be potentially some balance issues, word finding. One, you're just not going to feel yourself. And that was my biggest thing. Is like, man, I used to be able to remember, do vital signs in the back of an ambulance, and like I could take like 3 sets of vital signs and I have to write them down, and I could remember them 20 minutes later as I'm writing my report out. And dude, now I joke, but sometimes I'm like, man, how do I tie my shoes this morning? So I can't remember. Like my wife will tell me, here's a good example. Just yesterday, we went to the grocery store. She said, hey, I need you to run in. Only need you to grab a couple vegetables and milk. I got the vegetables. I grabbed apples, which are fruit, and I forgot the milk. She makes fun of me. I still struggle. But when you start seeing stuff like that, that's where you have to have the advocate. Hey, here's what I'm doing. Start taking a journal and stuff, and then go talk to providers. Listen, I've had multiple head injuries, or I know X, Y, and Z. I've never been treated. I think I may have a TBI because here's what I'm seeing. Now, is there anything out there? Can I go test, blah, blah, blah? They're going to start you with CAT scan, MRI, all that other stuff, but don't give up. Keep going. You got to be your own advocate. And then just keep researching. Mark's Institute of Brain Health is great. I think the NICO, National Intrepid Center of Excellence, is more for active duty, but I'm pretty sure that's still operational out of Bethesda. And Gary Sinise Foundation just teamed up with the Marcus Institute. They're actually opening up 20 more brain type treatment centers for TBI, and it's free for veterans. You still have to apply and go and have the medical need, but go check them out. Go do some research, and all else fails, put them in contact with me. I'll gladly talk to anybody and try to get them the help they need to.
Yeah, great information. I'll make sure to link everything in the show notes for everything that you just mentioned. Colby, what is the best way to get in contact with you?
Email is always good. Colby.bowers@sentinelequitygroup.com. I'm on Instagram, Colby Bowers AF for Air Force. Somebody else has had it all taken. Besides helping out with this, we also do, kind of financial well-being and getting veterans to invest in real estate and stuff that's non-traditional. We do some educational stuff on that as well. We've got some opportunities coming up for veterans and first responders to help for their retirement.
Yeah, and then if you want to just talk about that for a second while we're on that topic, for anyone that's interested or might want to reach out to you about that.
The military doesn't do a good job of really setting folks up for retirement, right? And obviously, we don't join the military for the paycheck. We definitely don't stay in for it. And, when we get out and retire, everything's like, oh, let's go get another job because that's what we have to. Even if you're retired, you can't live off of it. I retired and I'm still working. So a lot of everyone's in that same situation. And so I found out early on, and I love real estate. I still invest in the stock market. I have a financial advisor, have all that other stuff. But real estate is challenging to get into unless you're rich, especially if you want to do it passively. And so what my team and I, my partner and I, who's also a veteran, Marine veteran, we're doing some education for veterans and first responders, part of our giving back. And I won't go into the details because of SEC law requirements right now. Because of the opportunities we're offering and stuff, we have to have an established relationship. But we have some really cool stuff for veterans and responders coming up in 2023 that they can basically potentially get themselves into, invest in, that typically the Warren Buffetts, the institutional level investors, the millionaires only have access to. Any of your listeners are interested in learning more about that, hit me up directly and we can set up some phone calls and I can get them in the pipeline and get them over some information as well.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to post your email also in the show notes for anyone that wants to reach out about that. Phenomenal opportunity. I say this all the time for active duty, for veterans, for anyone who's wanting to figure out a way to diversify their finances or, figure out a different way. I was talking to someone the other day about getting out of the military and how some people get out and they're very successful. Other people get out and they end up homeless. Where's the disconnect here? And I think that's one of the pieces to the puzzle is just that financial literacy and being set up well to separate, because most of the people giving advice to the people that are active duty have never actually separated from the military. So they can't actually give that good advice. But I appreciate that you're out here doing so much for the veteran community, for the military community. And one last thing before we end, is there any last words that you want to leave the listeners with?
No matter where you are in life, you can always get better. So, if you are struggling with mental health, if you're struggling with anything, take a step back and reevaluate. One of the biggest things I learned after I got out of the military is don't figure out the how, find the who. So if you're trying to figure out is how do I get better in my mental health, right? Because that's obviously what we're focusing on here. You don't need to figure that out. Find the who. Somebody can help you figure that out. If you need help on the financial side of things, right, or finding a job, it's not just the how, but it's the who. And that's with networking. That's with finding these different corporations, these different organizations out there, different people, other veterans that have already done it. Don't focus on the how. Figure out on the who, find those who's, and they're going to help you get to where you need to.
Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.